Kethavar pressed his face against the cold metal of the viewing window. Space stretched endlessly before him, filled with stars that had watched over the galaxy for billions of years. But today something new moved through that ancient darkness. Ships. Human ships. They looked wrong. Every other species in the coalition built their vessels with smooth curves and gleaming surfaces. These human ships were different. They had sharp edges and rough metal plating. Burn marks covered their hulls like battle scars. They moved through space like angry predators hunting for prey. Ugly things, aren't they? Admiral Zexthal's voice made Kethvar turn around. The tall, blue-skinned Zenthari officer stood behind him, all four arms crossed over his chest. Hard to believe these primitives think they can help us fight the Void Swarm. Kethvar nodded slowly. As an ambassador of the Altarian Republic, he had seen many species join the coalition over the years. Most came with advanced technology and elegant solutions to complex problems. The humans brought crude fusion engines and weapons that threw metal chunks at high speed. It seemed almost insulting that they wanted to join the greatest military alliance in known space. The Council approved their request. Kethvar said carefully, "They must see something in them." "Desperation," Zexthal replied with a bitter laugh. "We've lost 12 worlds to the Void Swarm in the past year. At this point, we'd accept help from space pirates if they offered." The docking bay doors opened with a deep rumble that Kethvar felt in his bones. The largest human ship moved inside like a sleeping giant waking up. Its metal hull was scratched and dented from countless battles. Strange symbols were painted on its side in what looked like human writing. Kethvar couldn't read the words, but something about them seemed aggressive. "I should go meet them," Kethvar said. "The Council wants a full report on their capabilities." "Good luck with that," Zexthal muttered. "Try not to let them smell your fear." The comment confused Kethvar, but he didn't have time to ask what it meant. The airlock was already cycling through its sequence. In a few minutes, he would meet humanity for the first time. The airlock door opened with a soft hiss. 2 humans stepped through, and Kethvar immediately understood what Zexthal had meant about smelling fear. These creatures looked like predators. They walked on 2 legs like Altarians, but their movements were different. More controlled, more dangerous. The first human was older, with gray hair and lines around his eyes. He wore a dark uniform covered in metal badges. When he looked at Kethvar, his gaze was steady and calculating. This was clearly their leader. "Admiral Hyunwoo Kim," the human said, extending his hand. Kethvar had learned about this greeting ritual from the briefing files. He reached out and shook the offered hand, trying not to flinch at how strong the human's grip was. "Ambassador Kethvar of the Altarian Republic," he replied. "Welcome to Coalition Station Theta 7. The second human stepped forward. She was younger than the Admiral, with short black hair and dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. "Commander Da-eun Park," she said simply. Her handshake was just as firm as her superiors. "We're grateful for the opportunity to serve alongside the Coalition," Admiral Kim said. His words were polite, but something in his tone suggested he didn't really need anyone's permission to do anything. "Of course," Kethvar replied. "Perhaps you'd like to see our command center."
"Admiral Zexthal is preparing a briefing on our current tactical situation." The humans followed him through the station's corridors.
Kethvar noticed how they moved differently from other species. Most Coalition members walked in relaxed groups, chatting about their families or their homeworlds. The humans moved in formation, always watching the spaces around them. They kept their hands near their weapons. The command center was the heart of the station. Holographic displays showed the positions of Coalition fleets across 3 star systems. Red markers indicated worlds that had fallen to the Void Swarm. There were too many red markers. Admiral Zexthal stood at the main display, surrounded by other Coalition officers. When the humans entered, conversation stopped. Everyone turned to stare at the new arrivals. "Admiral Kim," Zexthal said formally, "welcome. I trust your journey was acceptable?" "We've traveled farther for less important reasons," Kim replied. Zexthal activated the tactical display. The hologram showed the Nexus sector, where Coalition forces were trying to hold back the latest Void Swarm advance. "As you can see, our situation is challenging. The Swarm has adapted to most of our conventional weapons. Their regenerative abilities make them nearly impossible to destroy permanently." Kethvar watched the humans study the display. Their faces showed no emotion, but he could sense their minds working. They were analyzing everything, filing away information for later use. "Tell us about their regeneration," Commander Park said. Remarkable, really, Zexthul continued. Even when severely damaged, void creatures can rebuild themselves from minimal remaining tissue. They share some kind of collective consciousness that allows them to coordinate across vast distances. They feel no fear, show no mercy, and never retreat. What's their pain threshold? Admiral Kim asked. The question made every coalition officer pause. Pain threshold? What did that have to do with military tactics? I'm not sure I understand, Zexthul said slowly. Pain, Kim repeated. How much damage can they take before it affects their behavior? They don't experience pain the way we do, Zexthul explained. That's part of what makes them so dangerous. You can't shock them or demoralize them. They just keep coming until they're completely destroyed. Kim nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. Commander Park leaned forward to study the tactical display more closely. These coordination networks, she said. Are they based on biological connections or some kind of energy field? Energy, we think, replied Captain Vortek, a Mentari scientist. They seem to communicate through quantum entanglement across space-time. Can that communication be intercepted? We've tried, but their signals are too complex to decode. What about disrupted? The coalition officers exchanged glances. They had spent years trying to understand the Void Swarm's communication system. The humans had been here for 10 minutes and were already asking questions that no one had considered. We request immediate deployment to the front lines,
Admiral Kim said suddenly. That might not be wise, Zexthul replied.
Your forces are inexperienced with this enemy. Perhaps some training exercises first? We learn better under actual combat conditions, Commander Park said. Her voice was calm, but there was something in her eyes that made Kethvar uncomfortable. Very well, Zexthul agreed reluctantly. I'll assign Ambassador Kethvar as your liaison. He can observe your methods and report back to the Council. Kethvar felt his stomach drop. Being assigned to the humans felt less like an honor and more like a punishment. But he nodded professionally. I look forward to working with you. Admiral Kim smiled, and Kethvar wished he hadn't. There was something predatory about that smile. Something that suggested the humans knew exactly what they were getting into, and they were looking forward to it. So do we, Ambassador, Kim said. So do we. As the briefing continued, Kethvar found himself studying the humans more carefully. They asked detailed questions about Void Swarm biology, behavior patterns, and weaknesses, but their questions were different from what coalition strategists typically asked. They weren't interested in elegant solutions or minimal casualties. They were interested in causing maximum damage. The meeting ended with deployment schedules and supply requisitions. As the various officers filed out, Kethvar lingered near the humans. Is there anything else you need to know about the Void Swarm? He asked. Admiral Kim looked at him with those calculating eyes. Just one thing, Ambassador. What's that? Do they dream? The planet Kethmore looked like a wound in space. What had once been green fields and blue oceans was now a twisted landscape of black crystal and writhing shadows. The Void Swarm had been feeding on this world for 3 weeks, turning everything they touched into more of themselves. Kethvar sat in the human dropship, trying not to look at the planet below. The ship shook and rattled as it cut through the atmosphere. Every other coalition transport he'd traveled in had smooth, quiet rides. This human machine sounded like it was falling apart. First time in a real combat zone? Captain Jinho Lee asked from the seat across from him. The human officer was young, but moved with the confidence of someone who had seen many battles. I've been in combat situations before, Kethvar replied, though his voice sounded less steady than he wanted. Not like this, said Lieutenant So Young Choi. She was checking her weapon, a crude-looking device that fired metal projectiles. The Void Swarm doesn't fight like other enemies. They get inside your head. Through the small window, Kethvar could see coalition forces on the ground. Elegant energy weapons fired bright beams at shadowy creatures that seemed to absorb the light. The coalition soldiers moved in perfect formations, using tactics that had worked against conventional enemies for centuries. They were losing badly. Coalition Command, this is Reaper 1. Captain Lee spoke into his radio. We're 30 seconds from the drop zone. Request immediate support on the eastern flank. Reaper 1 Coalition Command. Eastern flank is compromised. Void creatures have possessed 3 of our hover tanks. Recommend you divert to secondary landing zone. Negative, Command. We're going in as planned. Kethvar felt his stomach tighten. Captain, if the Coalition forces say it's too dangerous, the Coalition forces have been fighting these things the same way for years, Lee interrupted. That's why they keep losing. The dropship's rear door opened with a mechanical whine. Wind and smoke rushed in, carrying the smell of burning metal and something else. Something wrong. The void swarm had a scent like rotting starlight, if such a thing were possible. 30 seconds, Lieutenant Choi shouted over the noise. Kethavar looked out at the battlefield below. Void creatures moved like liquid shadow, flowing around Coalition defenses. They were beautiful in a terrible way, like living nightmares that someone had carved from darkness and given teeth. 10 seconds. The humans around him stood up and checked their equipment one final time. Their movements were calm and professional, as if they were going to a training exercise instead of jumping into hell. Go, go, go. Kethavar found himself pushed out of the dropship along with the human soldiers. His Coalition-issued gravity pack slowed his fall, but the humans dropped faster, using primitive parachutes that looked like they might fail at any moment. They landed in the middle of chaos. Coalition soldiers were retreating from 3 directions while void creatures pursued them. The shadowy monsters flowed over the ground like spilled ink, absorbing energy weapon fire without slowing down. Form up on me, Captain Lee shouted. The human soldiers quickly arranged themselves in a tight formation. They didn't look scared. They looked hungry. A Coalition officer ran toward them, his blue skin pale with fear. You need to fall back, he gasped. The eastern defenses have collapsed. We can't hold them. Where are the creatures coming from? Lee asked calmly. Everywhere. They're using our own equipment against us. 3 hover tanks, 2 artillery pieces. I didn't ask what they took, Lee interrupted. I asked where they're coming from. The Coalition officer pointed toward a ridge covered in writhing shadows. There's some kind of spawning ground over there, but we can't get close enough to... Thank you. Lee turned to his soldiers. Reaper Squad, advance on the ridge. Standard hunter-killer formation. Captain, Kethavar said urgently, the Coalition has been trying to reach that position for days. You can't just watch us. The humans began moving forward while everyone else was retreating. They didn't use energy weapons like the Coalition forces. Instead, they carried projectile weapons that fired metal bullets and explosive shells. Primitive technology that seemed almost insulting compared to the advanced energy systems that the void swarm was absorbing. Group of void creatures noticed the advancing humans and flowed toward them like a dark tide. Kethavar expected the humans to open fire immediately, but they waited. The creatures came closer. Closer. Now, Lee said quietly. The humans opened fire with everything they had, but they weren't aiming to kill. They were aiming to wound. Their bullets tore into the void creatures, damaging but not destroying them. The wounded creatures writhed and twisted, making sounds that Kethavar had never heard before. Sounds like screaming. Capture nets now, Lieutenant Choi ordered. The humans threw weighted nets over the wounded creatures, trapping them. The void monsters thrashed against the restraints, their movements becoming more frantic as they realized they couldn't escape. What are you doing? Kethavar asked in horror. Research, Captain Lee replied calmly. He pulled out a small device that looked like a medical scanner. We need to understand what makes them tick. The captured void creatures were making more noise now. The sounds they produced weren't quite screams and weren't quite roars. They were something worse. They were the sounds of things that had never known pain suddenly learning what agony meant. Other void creatures in the area began behaving strangely. Instead of their usual coordinated advance, they started moving erratically. Some stopped advancing entirely. Others began backing away from the human positions. Fascinating, Lee murmured, studying his scanner readings. Lieutenant, increase the frequency on Specimen 3. Choi adjusted something on a small device attached to one of the nets. The trapped creature's struggles became more violent, and the sounds it made grew louder. The reaction from other void creatures was immediate. The entire swarm in the area began retreating toward the ridge, moving in confused, panicked patterns instead of their usual smooth coordination. Captain Lee, Kethavar said, his voice shaking. What exactly are you doing to those creatures? Teaching them about fear, Lee replied. Every species in the galaxy knows fear. Even these things, they just forgot what it felt like. A Coalition hover tank that had been possessed by the void swarm suddenly stopped moving. The dark energy that had been controlling it seemed to withdraw, leaving the vehicle empty and silent. Sir, one of the human soldiers called out, the possessed equipment is going offline. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Good. Begin Protocol Nightmare. Full implementation. Protocol Nightmare? Kethvar asked. Standard human military doctrine, Lieutenant Choi explained. When fighting an enemy that doesn't understand fear, you teach them. When fighting an enemy that doesn't feel pain, you show them what they're missing. More human dropships appeared in the sky, carrying additional troops and equipment. But this wasn't normal military equipment. These were mobile laboratories, field research stations, and things that Kethvar couldn't identify but instinctively knew he didn't want to understand. The humans began setting up their equipment with mechanical efficiency. They treated the captured void creatures like scientific specimens, studying their reactions to various stimuli. Every scream, every twitch, every sign of distress was recorded and analyzed. This is wrong, Kethvar said to Captain Lee. These things may be our enemies, but this is torture. Lee looked at him with those calm, predatory eyes. Ambassador, do you know how many Coalition worlds the Void Swarm has consumed? 12, but do you know how many Coalition soldiers have died fighting them? That's not the point. It is exactly the point. Lee's voice remained steady, but something cold had entered it. The Coalition has been fighting fair against an enemy that devours entire civilizations.
How's that working out?
Across the battlefield, the Void Swarm's retreat was accelerating. Creatures that had never shown fear in recorded history were fleeing from the sounds of their captured kin. The Coalition forces, confused but grateful, began advancing to reclaim lost ground. We're winning, Kethvar said weakly. Yes, Lee agreed. We are. As night fell over Kethmore, the humans continued their work. They had established a perimeter around their research stations, using the sounds of tortured void creatures as a weapon more effective than any energy cannon. Kethvar sat in the human command post, writing his initial report. Outside, he could hear the ongoing experiments. The void creatures were learning about pain, about fear, about concepts they had never encountered in their billions of years of existence. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the human perimeter, the rest of the Void Swarm was learning those lessons too. Get some sleep, Ambassador, Captain Lee said, settling into a chair next to him. Tomorrow we begin the real work. What's the real work? Lee smiled that predatory smile again. Tomorrow we teach them about nightmares. The underground bunker felt like a tomb. Kethvar followed Colonel Taehyun Song through corridors carved from solid rock, deep beneath the surface of Kethmore. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, and the air recyclers hummed with a sound that reminded him too much of the void creature's screams. The Coalition built this facility as a fallback position, Song explained as they walked. When we arrived, it was empty except for some automated defense systems. Perfect for our needs. They had been underground for 3 days since the successful defense of the planet's surface. The Void Swarm had retreated to deep space, leaving behind only scattered remnants hiding in caves and abandoned buildings. The Coalition called it a victory. The humans called it an opportunity. What exactly are your needs? Kethvar asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Song stopped at a heavy blast door marked with human symbols. He pressed his hand against a scanner and the door opened with a soft hiss. Understanding, Ambassador. We need to understand our enemy completely. The room beyond the door made Kethvar's blood freeze. It looked like a medical facility, but everything was wrong. Tables held void creatures in various states of containment. Machines monitored their vital signs while other devices subjected them to different types of stimuli. The creatures were alive but restrained, their dark energy forms held in place by some kind of electromagnetic field. Welcome to Research Division, said Major Yoon Ji-han, looking up from a console covered in readouts. She was young for a human military officer, but her eyes held the same cold calculation that Kethvar had seen in all the human soldiers. We've learned more about the Void Swarm in 3 days than the Coalition discovered in 20 years. Kethvar forced himself to look at the nearest table. The captured creature writhed against its restraints, producing that terrible not-quite scream that he had heard on the battlefield. Electrodes connected to its form transmitted data to monitoring equipment. What are you doing to it? He asked. Learning what makes it afraid, Major Han replied matter-of-factly. Everything fears something, Ambassador. Even things that have spent eons consuming galaxies. We just have to find the right frequency. She gestured to a wall display showing wave patterns and data streams. The void creatures communicate through quantum-entangled energy fields. But those same fields that connect them also make them vulnerable. When one experiences trauma, they all feel echoes of it. Colonel Song joined them at the display. "Show him the breakthrough, Major." Han's fingers moved across her control panel. On the screen, a three-dimensional map appeared showing void creature locations across several star systems. Red dots marked known swarm positions. "Watch this," Han said. She activated something on her console. The creature on the nearest table began thrashing more violently. Its screams grew louder and more desperate. On the display screen, the red dots representing distant void creatures began moving erratically. Some disappeared entirely. "They're retreating," Kethvar whispered. "From 12 light-years away," Song confirmed. The quantum connection that makes them so coordinated also makes them incredibly vulnerable to psychological warfare. When we cause enough distress to one creature, the entire local network feels it. Kethvar watched the display in horrified fascination. Across multiple star systems, void creatures were abandoning their positions and fleeing deeper into space, all because of what was being done to a single captured specimen in an underground bunker. "This is..." He started, then stopped. He didn't have words for what this was. "Effective," Han finished for him. "The Coalition has been fighting a physical war against a psychological enemy. We're correcting that mistake." They moved to another section of the facility. Here, humans in white coats worked at stations that looked more like torture chambers than scientific equipment. Each station held a different type of void creature, and each was being subjected to different experiments. "We've identified 17 distinct subspecies within the swarm," Song explained. "Each responds to different stimuli. The larger command variants are particularly sensitive to isolation anxiety. The smaller drones experience something analogous to claustrophobia." A human technician looked up from his work. "Colonel, Specimen 7 is showing interesting responses to the fear frequency modulation. Should we proceed to the next phase?" "Proceed," Song ordered. The technician made an adjustment to his equipment. The void creature at his station began producing new sounds, more complex and desperate than before. On monitors throughout the room, distant swarm formations began breaking apart and scattering. "Fear is contagious for them," Han explained. "Their quantum network was designed to share strength and coordination. But it also shares weakness and terror. We're using their greatest advantage against them." Kethvar felt sick. "How can you do this?" "Yes, there are enemies, but this is systematic torture." Colonel Song turned to face him directly. "Ambassador, how many civilians died when the Void Swarm consumed the Centauri colonies?" 47 million, Kethvar replied automatically. "How many when they devoured the rings of Altair?" 112 million. "And how many coalition soldiers have died fighting them with conventional weapons?" Kethvar knew the numbers by heart. Every coalition citizen did. Over 8 million in the past decade. "Now tell me." Song's voice remained calm but carried a weight that made Kethvar step back. "How many human soldiers have died since we began using these methods?" Kethvar realized he didn't know the answer. "None," Song continued. "0 human casualties since we started teaching the Void Swarm about fear. Our methods may offend your moral sensibilities, Ambassador, but they work." They moved to a final section of the facility. Here, the equipment looked different, more sophisticated. Instead of individual creatures being studied, entire groups were held in large containment fields. "This is where we test group dynamics," Han explained. "We've discovered that void creatures have a collective unconscious. When we introduce trauma into that collective space, it spreads like a virus through their entire network." She activated a device that projected some kind of energy field into the containment area. The creatures inside began reacting immediately, but not with their usual screams. Instead, they huddled together trying to hide from something that wasn't physically there. "What are you showing them?" Kethvar asked. "Their worst nightmare," Han replied. "We recorded the death agonies of their captured specimens and created a feedback loop. Now they're experiencing the fear of being afraid, terror of terror itself." On the main display, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Void swarm formations across 3 star systems began retreating in panic. Some groups fragmented entirely, breaking their quantum connections and scattering into deep space where they would be isolated and vulnerable. "It's working too well," Song observed. "At this rate, the entire swarm will be in full retreat within a month." "That's good, isn't it?" Kethvar asked. "For the immediate war, yes, but we need to consider the long-term implications. If the Void Swarm retreats entirely, they might regroup somewhere beyond our reach. When they return, they'll be prepared for psychological warfare. Han nodded. That's why we're developing the Prometheus Protocol. Instead of just scaring them away, we'll make sure they can never recover. What's the Prometheus Protocol? Song and Han exchanged a look. That's classified above your clearance level, Ambassador. But I can tell you this. When we're finished, the galaxy will never have to worry about the Void Swarm again. As they left the research facility, Kethvar's mind raced with what he had seen. The humans weren't just fighting the Void Swarm. They were systematically destroying the creature's ability to function as a cohesive force. They were weaponizing fear itself. Colonel, he said as they walked back through the corridors, what happens when this war is over? What happens to all this research, all these techniques you've developed? Song stopped walking and turned to face him. What do you think happens to it, Ambassador? I don't know. That's why I'm asking. It gets filed away in our military databases, cataloged and stored for future reference, just in case we ever need it again. Need it for what? Song's smile was the coldest thing Kethvar had ever seen, for whoever our next enemy turns out to be. That night, alone in his quarters, Kethvar tried to write his report to the Coalition Council. But every time he started, he found himself staring at a blank screen. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he make them understand that humanity had found a way to weaponize nightmare itself? Outside his window, human patrol ships moved through the darkness around Kethmore. They were protecting the planet from any remaining void creatures. But as Kethvar watched those ships move through the night, he realized something that made his blood run cold. He wasn't afraid of the Void Swarm anymore. He was afraid of the humans who had saved them from it. The Nexus battlefield stretched across 3 star systems, a wound in space itself where reality seemed to bleed. Kethvar stood on the command deck of the Coalition flagship, watching through the armored viewing ports as the largest Void Swarm incursion in galactic history poured out of a massive tear in spacetime. The portal was enormous, easily the size of a small moon. Through it came endless streams of void creatures, more than Kethvar had ever imagined could exist. They moved like a living tsunami of darkness, consuming everything in their path. Coalition forces are falling back on all fronts, reported Admiral Zexthul, his forearms working frantically at different control stations. We've lost contact with Battle Group 7 and 12. The Kenthari 3rd Fleet has been completely overrun. Around the command center, Coalition officers struggled to maintain order as their formations crumbled. This was worse than anyone had anticipated. The Void Swarm wasn't just attacking. They were launching a full-scale invasion that could consume the entire galactic core. Where are the humans? Kethvar asked. General Woojin Park's forces are holding position at Nexus Point Alpha, Zexthul replied. They refuse to retreat even though they're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Through the tactical display, Kethvar could see the human battle formation. It was tiny compared to the massive Void Swarm approaching it, like a single candle trying to hold back an ocean of darkness. But the humans weren't retreating. They were advancing. Get me General Park, Zexthul ordered. The hologram of a stern-faced human appeared above the command table. General Park looked older than the other human officers Kethvar had met, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. Behind him, the command deck of his ship was a scene of controlled chaos as human officers prepared for what looked like a suicide mission. General, you need to fall back, Zexthul said urgently. Your position is about to be overrun. Negative, Park replied calmly. We're exactly where we need to be. You have less than 50 ships against hundreds of thousands of void creatures. Quality over quantity, Admiral. We'll hold the line. The transmission cut off, leaving the Coalition command staff staring at each other in disbelief. Kethvar had spent months observing human military doctrine, but even he couldn't understand what they were trying to accomplish. On the tactical display, the human fleet moved into an intricate formation that looked almost ceremonial. Their ships arranged themselves in a perfect spiral pattern around Nexus Point Alpha, with General Park's flagship at the center. What are they doing? Admiral Zexthul asked. Kethvar was beginning to suspect he knew, and the thought terrified him. The Void Swarm reached the human position. Instead of the expected destruction, something else happened. The human ships began broadcasting something across all frequencies, a signal that made every Coalition communication system crackle with interference. At first, it sounded like static. Then Kethvar realized what he was hearing. Screaming. the death agonies of every void creature the humans had captured and tortured over the past months. Layer upon layer of terror and agony, broadcast at volumes that could be heard across entire star systems. The effect on the void swarm was immediate and devastating. Their coordinated advance faltered as individual creatures began writhing in apparent pain. The quantum network that connected them started carrying signals they had never experienced before. Pure, distilled fear. Impossible, breathed Captain Vortek. They're using psychological warfare on a strategic scale. More human ships appeared from hyperspace, but these weren't warships. They were mobile broadcast stations, each one transmitting the collected screams and terrors of captured void specimens. The signal spread through the quantum network like a virus, infecting every creature connected to it. Commander Hiram Jung's voice crackled over the communication system from one of the broadcasting ships. Coalition Command, this is Nightmare Actual. Operation Terrorstorm is now active. Recommend all Coalition forces maintain safe distance from broadcast zones. What's Operation Terrorstorm? Admiral Zexthal demanded. Weaponized fear, Kethvar said quietly. They're not just fighting the void swarm, they're driving them insane. The tactical display showed the effect spreading through the enemy formation. Void creatures that had never known fear were experiencing panic for the first time in their existence. Their perfect coordination dissolved into chaos as individual creatures tried to flee from sounds that existed only in their quantum-linked consciousness. But the humans weren't finished. General, Park's flagship began deploying devices that looked like metallic flowers, each one unfolding in the vacuum of space. As they activated, new signals joined the broadcast, more complex and more terrible than simple screams. Fear bombs, Kethvar whispered, recognizing the devices from his time in the research facility. They're broadcasting the dying thoughts of void creatures back into the network. The effect was beyond devastating. It was apocalyptic. The void swarm began turning on itself as creatures infected with artificial terror attacked their own kind. The quantum network that had been their greatest strength became a conduit for their worst nightmares. But watching the battle unfold, Kethvar noticed something that chilled him more than the void swarm ever had. The humans weren't just winning, they were enjoying it. On the communication channels, he could hear human officers reporting casualty figures and tactical updates with voices that barely contained excitement. They spoke about the enemy's psychological breakdown the way other species might discuss a particularly good meal. Sir, one of the human officers reported to General Park, void formations in Sector 7 through 12 are showing complete neural collapse. They're no longer responding to stimuli. Excellent, Park replied. Begin Phase 2. Deploy the Nightmare Protocol. New signals joined the cacophony, sounds that weren't screams or death agonies, but something worse. They were the sounds of hope being destroyed, of creatures realizing that their suffering would never end. The void swarm's retreat became a rout. Creatures that had consumed galaxies fled in terror from an enemy that had weaponized their own consciousness against them. The massive portal began to collapse as the beings controlling it lost coherent thought. Coalition forces, advance, Admiral Zexthal ordered, his voice filled with awe and horror in equal measure. As coalition ships moved forward to reclaim lost territory, they found battlefields covered with the remains of void creatures that had literally died of fear. Others had retreated so far into their own quantum network that they had become catatonic, unable to function in physical reality. General Park, Admiral Zexthal called over the communication system. Your tactics were effective. Thank you, Admiral. But we're not done yet. What do you mean? Park's hologram appeared again, and this time his smile was visible. It was not a pleasant expression. The swarm will try to regroup. They'll retreat to their deep space strongholds and attempt to develop countermeasures. We can't allow that. You want to pursue them? I want to finish them permanently. The word permanently carried a weight that made every coalition officer in the command center step back from their stations. Commander, Jung's voice joined the conversation from her broadcast ship. Admiral, we've developed a way to make the fear permanent. A feedback loop that will trap the void creatures in their own worst nightmares forever. Forever? Kethvar asked, though he knew no one was listening to him. The quantum network that connects them can be modified, Park explained. Instead of sharing strength, it will share endless terror. They'll spend eternity experiencing the deaths of every creature they've ever consumed. feeling the fear of every world they've destroyed. Admiral Zexthul was quiet for a long moment. "General, that would be genocide," Park finished. "Yes, it would. Do you have a problem with that?" The silence in the Coalition Command Center was deafening. Every officer present knew what the Void Swarm had done to countless civilizations. They had devoured entire species, consumed whole galaxies without mercy or remorse, but this— "No," Admiral Zexthul said finally. "No, General. I don't have a problem with that." As the human forces began their next phase of operations, Kiethvar found himself staring out at the battlefield. The Void Swarm was in full retreat, fleeing from an enemy that had turned their greatest strength into their worst weakness. But the humans weren't satisfied with victory. They wanted to ensure that their enemy could never threaten anyone again, ever. And as Kethvar watched General Park coordinate the deployment of devices that would trap billions of creatures in eternal nightmares, he realized something that made his hands shake. The humans weren't just winning the war. They were enjoying every moment of it. The Coalition command ship Eternal Vigil hung in orbit around Kalem Prime like a metal moon. Through the massive viewing ports of the main conference room, Kethvar could see the planet below, green and blue and alive. No longer the twisted wasteland it had been under Void Swarm occupation. The war was over. Across 17 star systems, void creatures were either dead or fleeing into deep space. For the first time in decades, Coalition worlds were safe from the shadow that had consumed so many of their neighbors. But Kethvar couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The conference room was filled with the highest-ranking officers from every Coalition species. Admiral Zexthul sat at the head of the table, his blue skin pale with exhaustion. Around him, generals and admirals from a dozen different worlds reviewed casualty reports and territorial reclamation statistics. At the far end of the table sat the humans. Captain Minseo. Kang looked exactly like what she was, a predator wearing a military uniform. Her dark eyes moved constantly, cataloging every person in the room, every exit, every potential threat. Beside her, Commander Jaewon Lim studied a datapad with the intense concentration of someone reading poetry. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Zexthul began, "we are gathered here to discuss the final phase of our campaign against the Void Swarm. Captain Kang, would you please present your proposal?" Kang stood up smoothly, activating a holographic display above the conference table. The image showed a three-dimensional map of known space, with red markers indicating the last confirmed positions of fleeing void creatures. "The enemy is scattered but not defeated," she said in her precise, emotionless voice. "Intelligence reports indicate that Void Swarm remnants are regrouping in the Outer Rim territories. If allowed to consolidate, they could return within 50 years. Murmurs of concern rippled around the table. The Coalition had barely survived this war. Another conflict in 50 years might destroy them entirely. "What do you propose?" asked General Thaxmore of the Regelian Defense Force. Kang's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Complete eradication. Permanent solution." The holographic display zoomed in on the Outer Rim, showing estimated positions of Void Swarm survivors. There were thousands of them, possibly millions, scattered across empty space between galaxies. "We call it the Prometheus Protocol," Commander Lim added, speaking for the first time. "A quantum biological weapon designed specifically for the Void Swarm's physiology." "Biological weapon?" Admiral Zexthul leaned forward. "You mean a plague?" "Not exactly," Kang replied. "Something more targeted. We've spent months studying void creature biology and psychology. We know exactly how their quantum network functions, how their consciousness operates, how they experience reality," she gestured, and the display changed to show microscopic structures that looked like crystalline viruses. "The Prometheus Protocol introduces modified quantum patterns into their network. Instead of sharing coordination and strength, they begin sharing something else." "Which is?" asked Captain Vortek. Kang's smile was barely visible, but Kethvar caught it. "Agony, pure, infinite agony. Every sensation of pain and terror that we've recorded from our experimental subjects, concentrated into a single quantum signature and transmitted through their entire species." The conference room went completely silent. "You're talking about torturing an entire species to death, Admiral," Zexthul said slowly. "We're talking about ensuring they can never threaten galactic civilization again," Lim corrected. "The weapon is self-replicating. Once introduced into any part of the Void network, it spreads to every connected creature across space and time. How long would it take? For complete species extinction? Approximately 72 hours after initial deployment. Kethvar felt his stomach twist. 72 hours of what? What would they experience? Kang turned those predator eyes on him. Everything, Ambassador. Every death they've caused, every world they've consumed, every moment of terror they've inflicted on others. All of it simultaneously for every creature in their species. That's... Kethvar struggled for words. That's not warfare. That's not even genocide. That's something beyond evil, is it? Commander Lim asked. The Void Swarm has consumed over 300 billion sentient beings in the past millennium. They've destroyed entire civilizations without mercy or hesitation. Are we supposed to show them compassion they never showed anyone else? Around the table, coalition officers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked horrified. Others looked thoughtful. A few were nodding in agreement. The strategic advantage is clear, Kang continued. Complete elimination of the threat with zero risk to coalition forces. The weapon can be deployed remotely and requires no follow-up action. What about other species? Asked General Mordak. Could this weapon affect anyone else? Impossible, Lim replied immediately. The quantum signature is specifically tuned to Void Swarm biology. No other known species uses their particular form of quantum entanglement. Admiral Zexthul was quiet for a long moment, staring at the holographic display. Finally, he spoke. Captain Kang, this weapon, it's already built, isn't it? Yes, sir. We've been field testing prototypes for the past month. The results exceed all expectations. You've already used it? On isolated void pockets in the Kepler sector. Complete elimination within the projected time frame. No survivors, no adaptation, no resistance. Kethvar realized what that meant. While the coalition had been celebrating their victory, the humans had been conducting secret weapons tests on living creatures. They had been perfecting a tool of absolute annihilation. I need to discuss this with the full council, Admiral Zexthul said finally. Of course, Kang replied. But I should mention that time is a factor. Every day we delay gives the Void Swarm more opportunity to adapt to our psychological warfare techniques. If they develop countermeasures, the window for Prometheus deployment may close permanently. How long do we have? 2 weeks maximum. After that, they'll be too dispersed and too prepared for the weapon to be fully effective. The meeting continued for another hour, but Kethvar barely heard the technical discussions and strategic debates. His mind kept returning to a single, terrifying thought. The humans had created a weapon that could erase an entire species from existence in 72 hours of unimaginable suffering, and they were proud of it. After the meeting, Kethvar found himself walking through the ship's corridors in a daze. He passed coalition officers from dozens of worlds, all of them discussing the proposed Prometheus protocol. Some were horrified by its implications. Others saw it as a necessary evil, but none of them seemed to understand what Kethvar had realized during the presentation. The humans hadn't created this weapon to end the current war. They had created it to ensure that no one would ever dare to start another war with humanity. Ambassador Kethvar. He turned to find Captain Kang approaching him, her footsteps silent on the metal deck. Captain, you seem troubled by our proposal. Troubled? Kethvar laughed, and the sound was more bitter than he intended. Captain, you just proposed committing the most complete act of genocide in galactic history. Troubled doesn't begin to describe how I feel. Kang studied him with those calculating eyes. Ambassador, may I ask you a question? Go ahead. If the Void Swarm had possessed this weapon, would they have hesitated to use it on us? The question hit Kethvar like a physical blow. That's not the point, isn't it? The only reason we're having this conversation is because we won. If the Void Swarm had been victorious, there would be no moral debate. There would be no coalition. There would be nothing but empty space where our civilizations used to exist. So we should become monsters to defeat monsters? We should become whatever is necessary to protect the people we care about. Kang replied simply. The Void Swarm made their choice when they began consuming galaxies. We're simply completing the logical conclusion of that choice. She turned to leave, then paused. Ambassador, the Coalition Council will vote on the Prometheus Protocol in 3 days. I suspect they'll approve it. When they do, I want you to remember something. What's that? We didn't start this war, but we're going to finish it. As Captain Kang walked away, Kethvar remained in the corridor, staring out through a viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the Void Swarm were fleeing through deep space, unaware that their fate had already been decided. In 3 days, the Coalition Council would vote on whether to unleash a weapon that would torture billions of creatures to death over the course of 3 days. And Kethvar knew, with cold certainty, that they would vote yes.